Today, the global invisible war that you never read about in mainstream media, but which underlies all the other conflict you read about on front pages daily. I'm Rick Falking, and this is Liberties Report 39.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
In mainstream media, you read daily about conflicts over religion, conflicts over resources, conflicts over trade routes. There's an underlying reason to all of them, and it's coming to a head. For what's more important than, if you want geopolitical dominance, than controlling, say, the trade of oil? It's about controlling the currency used for the trade of oil. The conflict currently ongoing is about what the default trade currency of the world is going to be. Let's do a little history here. When the Arabian Peninsula, it was called that way a century ago, was pretty much a mess in the 1920s and 1930s. A United States company called Standard Oil of California signed a deal with a small thug tribe called Saud in that area. Standard Oil of California gave this tribe tons and tons of money in exchange for oil exploitation rights, and as a result, this particular warrior tribe managed to conquer the entire Arabian Peninsula, short of a little coast and a few areas. And therefore that peninsula is today known as Saudi Arabia, of House Saud. Obviously it helped that this particular tribe had a couple of imams with him who preached a particularly extreme form of Islam known as Wahhabism, essentially saying you should worship your ruler, your king, which became, of course, king of the House Saud. Now, in this era, the default trade currency was not the US dollar. It hasn't always been like that. It has been many currencies throughout history. In this era, it was the British pound sterling that was the predominant trade currency. Although between the world wars, this gradually shifted to using another currency, which was the US dollar. And by 1944, there was a so-called Bretton Woods Agreement that pretty much solidified the US dollar as the dominant trade currency of the world. The idea was simple. In exchange for reparations, whatever, to Europe, you'd get tons of loans, everything would be paid against the US dollar, and as a security and safety measure, and to build trust, you'd have a peg on the US dollar so that for every 35 US dollars, you could get 1 troy ounce of gold. The gold was the guarantee, has always been the guarantee. Now consider what situation this puts you in. If you want to buy something from China today, that means that you first need to buy US dollars from the people who are printing US dollars. And then exchange those US dollars for whatever it is you want from China. Imagine the situation this puts the United States in. For unlimited supply to the default trade currency means you also have unlimited supply of goods worldwide, as long as that status of default trade currency can be maintained. Now, it didn't last that long. The idea of having a currency backed up by something, for the war bankrupted the United States, frankly. And I'm not talking about World War II, I'm not talking about the Iraq War, I'm talking about the Vietnam War. The idea obviously was to have 100% coverage of every single US dollar in circulation. So you could have people coming to you with their IOUs and people would get gold in return, just as promised, only it was a fairy tale. It was a complete fabrication. Never existed, never would exist. And by 1971, the gold coverage was down to 22%. The United States had just printed so much money to fund the Vietnam War. Remember, they had the default trade currency, right? The United States had the default trade currency. They could print as much money as they wanted, literally. And they did. So, Vietnam, this mess which was inherited by French colonial a French colonial mess in its own turn, ironically bankrupted the United States. And the ones who found out were the French, was Charles de Gaulle of La France, who went to the US and said, guys, I think we won our gold. We don't really trust you guys anymore. We'd rather that you make good on your IOUs. And the US went, well, we ain't so sure about this deal, really. Can you just hold on for a minute here? Long story short, Charles de Gaulle got a bit of gold, and then something called the Nixon Shark happened. On August 15, 1971, the United States defaulted, declared bankruptcy. Now, it wasn't worded like that, obviously. It was President Nixon who went on television, onto the world stage and said, guys, we're not going to honor our debts. Sorry. You sit with a bunch of IOUs. You can trade them between yourselves as you want. We don't mind. You can forget about this gold that we promised you once. And, in any other setting, this would be called a bankruptcy. This would be called declaring bankruptcy. We're not going to pay back our loans. It wasn't called like that because the US is the US, so it was just called the Nixon Shark, or decoupling of gold. As in decoupling of paying back your loans. Decoupling of gold. At that point, the US was free to print as much money as it wanted. And it did. Since then, the money supply, as it's academically called, has just swelled. And people are starting to catch up to what's going on here. It's not just the Federal Reserve and Janet Yellen who did this quantitative easing, another academic term for ballooning the money supply to actually 4 times what it was before. This has been going on for quite some time. And it's not just the money supply. It's also the fact that if you're sitting on the trade currency, you tend to be sitting on the trade networks, as the United States is. Most international settlements happen through New York. And if you're sitting on international settlements, you get to say who gets to trade and who doesn't. This is important because this means that the United States is sitting on a master switch to every business in the entire world. The United States is sitting on a master switch, an extrajudicial master switch, to every business in the world. And we've seen the effects of this. We've seen what happened when WikiLeaks started embarrassing the administration of the United States. Somebody made a phone call to Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal, and the donations to WikiLeaks ceased overnight. The world is catching up to this. Russia and China in particular are getting very unhappy about the United States having a master switch to their businesses. So if the USD were to fail as a trade currency, the US would not just be fiscally bankrupt, but also politically bankrupt. This is key to understand. The US would lose a lot of its projection force. This is why you're seeing Russia and China in particular trying to build something that's going to circumvent the USD trade network, and do so in another denomination than the US dollar. That's why you're seeing China building a new global payment network, which a lot of Europe has already signed up to, which circumvents New York and US controls. This is why you're seeing Russia becoming the dominant economic player in the Middle East, something that was inconceivable a decade ago. This is why you're seeing Russia and China starting to make deals with each other to trade oil, because oil is key here, oil in something else than US dollars. And the instant oil is traded in something else than US dollars, the entire house of cards comes crashing down. Something interesting happened last week. 2 things happened. First, US Treasury Bonds were sold. That's not something particularly interesting itself, but in this particular case, the US Treasury Bonds were auctioned off at 0 interest. That means US Treasury Bonds were no better than keeping your money as cash in your mattress at home. That is the first time in history people don't put a premium on holding money as US government bonds. The second thing that happened was that China started dumping US Treasury bonds on the market en masse. Because there's another thing here. I mentioned that the US has been printing money like crazy just to import goods, just to maintain a luxury lifestyle, just to fund its military, which is larger than the next 26 nations combined in terms of military cost. But there's a deficit here. This is an enormous deficit. And the United States has been selling this deficit predominantly to China in the form of US government Treasury Bonds. This means the instant China stops buying, and even worse, selling US Treasury Bonds, the game is up. Because if China is selling US Treasury Bonds, that means the United States Treasury cannot sell them. Which means the deficit is unfunded. This happened last week. So, in the geopolitical game of dominance, we're in for a very interesting game between the US, Russia, and China. And this is coming to a showdown very soon. Now, Russia and China certainly have their own share of problems. Russia is struggling with a budget that was, frankly, written for an oil price that's twice the price it is today. And China has been borrowing heavily against future growth that has failed to materialize. So the music has stopped for the Chinese economy. So there's nothing set in stone here at this point. But the important thing here is that the war over the default trade currency serves as explanation for every single major conflict between the major powers that you read about daily. And yet this war, this conflict, this fight about who's going to be the king of the hill is something you never read about. But it's the power underlying everything. Think about that. If you have access to the default trade currency's money printing, you've got money coming down from the sky in unlimited amounts. Imagine sitting in that position and you see what people are fighting over. I'm Nick Faltinger, and this is Liberties Report. Visit our sponsor, Private Internet Access. See you next week.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Liberties Report is produced using exclusively free software.